So hi everybody, I want to welcome you on this rainy afternoon in Pittsburgh to today's talk, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce Sebastian Harnisch to you. Before I introduce Professor Harnisch to you, I'd like to thank Chiron Skinner in particular. Chiron Skinner runs our program for international relations and politics. You've been doing wonderful things. I think ever since you've been here, the impact has been tremendous. And there's been so much more emphasis ever since you came on political science in general, but especially foreign relations, international politics. And I'm really, really happy to see that. And I want to thank you for making this event possible. I also want to thank Amanda Kennard, who works in Chiron's office and who has been responsible for a lot of the technical details, getting things together for that. And I, of course, want to thank my own department, the Department of Modern Languages, and our department head, Susan Polanski, who has also helped out with this. There's a lot that I could say about Sebastian Harnisch. He runs the Institute for Political Science at the University of Heidelberg, which is the oldest university in Germany. And he is the international relations expert in that institute. And he specializes in particular in things like weapons of mass destruction. He's written a lot about North Korea. He's currently writing a textbook, actually, a textbook for students about foreign policy, German foreign policy, in the reunited Germany. He's written about the Constitution, international politics in the Constitution, and the process of Europeanization of united Germany. And he's co-edited books with other scholars, Europe and America, the European attitude towards European integration, the American attitude towards European integration. He's written about nuclear weapons in North Korea, not a very happy topic. So he's written about a lot of topics, and I'm very happy that today he can talk about German foreign policy in the period since reunification and the basic sources of Germany's foreign policy conduct. This is his first time in Pittsburgh, and we actually met yesterday. It happens that at the same time the Deputy General Consul from New York has been here, and he actually had an interview, a radio interview, yesterday with the Deputy General Consul. This, I think, is the first talk that I've ever witnessed, actually, at Carnegie Mellon specifically on the topic of German foreign policy. So let us welcome Professor Harnisch to Pittsburgh, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Stephen Brockman, and special thanks, of course, to Dr. Skinner and the Center for International Relations and Politics, as well as the Department for Modern Languages. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here tonight with you and share my thoughts on German foreign policy with you. The topic of today, 20 years after reunification, the sources of Germany's foreign policy conduct, is of course a very appropriate and timely theme for this anniversary, the 20th anniversary of German reunification. Over the last couple of months, some of you may have asked themselves, what, if anything, actually drives German elites these days? Because, of course, our president has resigned a couple of months ago. Several state premier ministers resigned in the last couple of months. And the defense minister quitted a couple of weeks ago. So, in a way, the German elite is in uproar. Well, when you ask for the reason why they resigned, I really don't know, actually, why they gone in these numbers. But seriously, now after a decade there is increased interest and concern about German foreign policy, both in Europe and abroad. Why is that the case? Well, do the extensive restrictions for Germany's deployment to Afghanistan indicate a dwindling solidarity within the Atlantic Alliance? Is Germany smoothly walking out of the alliance and the solidarity within NATO as the major Western alliance in the post-Cold War world? Does Germany's guarded support for Georgian and Ukrainian NATO membership indicate an unhealthy regard for Russian interests against the backdrop that, of course, Germany has commercial and natural resource interests in its dealings with Russia? And finally, what were the German policymakers up to during the latest Euro crisis when they hesitated to support Greece in March last year and made matters worse for Greece? To address these and other questions, I will proceed in 3 steps. First, I outline my main argument that sources of Germany's conduct in the last 2 decades can be found in its deeply ingrained foreign policy role concept, and I'm gonna explain what I mean by role concept later on, and a clash between the external and internal ties that bind Germany's executive power since 1945. You must take into account that after the Nazi period, the mothers and fathers of the German Constitution, the Grundgesetz, tried to really bind the Gulliver, or the Leviathan, if you will, by tying it to international law on the one hand. That was a very strict anchor put firmly into the Constitution. At the same time, to have increased checks and balances from within Germany in order to contain executive power in Germany. And the argument tonight is that these 2 anchors, if you will, or these 2 bondages, if you will, they are at cross-cutting pressures, and they pull and push Germany in different directions. And therefore, the conduct of Germany's post-unification foreign policy is characterized by these cross-cutting pressures from the international level on the one hand, and the domestic ties that bind the executive power of Germany on the other hand. Secondly, I briefly explore in 3 recent case studies Germany's conduct, 2 from Germany's European policy and 1 security policy, focusing on its engagement in Afghanistan. Thirdly, I conclude by pointing out that normalization, a term often used when describing Germany's conduct, is misleading. Why is that the case? Because, first question, what is normal in these days? One could ask, and I will come to that question later on. Now to my argument, and this is for the political scientists and the IR students among you. Theoretically speaking, the 3 major approaches in international relations, these are realism, liberalism, and constructivism, can all help to understand recent changes in Germany's conduct, even though the battle of competitive theory testing is not over when it comes to German foreign policy. But I see a lot of convergence between those 3 schools, and I will explain why that is the case. Those of you who are familiar a little bit with German foreign policy and with the work of Beverly Crawford from Berkeley will have noticed that she, as a realist, uses liberal and constructivist factors to explain Germany. And the challenge, of course, is that I let you know and explain to the non-political scientists for you what these terms really mean: liberalism, realism, constructivism. Empirically, the ongoing changes in Germany's trajectory have been interpreted as normalization. So Germany becomes like any other great power in Europe, like France or Britain, has the same deployment patterns, the same pattern to deal with lesser powers, and so forth. What are the main indicators for this normalization pattern? There is an expanded deployment of the Bundeswehr, that's our federal armed forces, and a growing hesitancy to commit to deeper integration within Europe. In the literature, you will find 4 factors that explain this normalization, becoming like the other European powers after unification. First factor, the costs of unification. Germany was used to use checkbook diplomacy to buy off other countries, to pay side payments to lesser power in order to make them realize that it is in their best interest, for example, to commit to further integration. Secondly, second factor, a crumbling cross-partisan consensus. So Germany's foreign policy since 1945 can be explained as an emerging consensus held between the 2 great parties, the so-called Volksparteien, CDU, the Conservative Party on the one hand, and the SPD on the other hand. Since unification, that bipartisanship is crumbling, as you can see in the voting patterns, for example, on foreign deployments. Third factor, and that is also a factor to describe and explain American foreign policy, the post-war baby boomers. So these are political leaders that have not the historical consciousness or experience of the Second World War and therefore have different judgments from the preceding generation. And last but not least, there is a new assertiveness by certain domestic veto players, we call them in political science. Veto players are those players who can simply stop the policy process if they want by constitutional means. And these are in the Federal Republic of Germany, on the one hand, the states, the so-called Bundesländer, on the one hand, because we have a second chamber where they have to vote on legislation. And on the other hand, and I will focus on that tonight a little bit, the Federal Constitutional Court, our Supreme Court, which is quite important in foreign policy these days. As a result, many pundits on German foreign policy argue that Berlin's reflexive multilateralism, Germany always strived not to be alone, to work together with other nations, because they were afraid, Germans were afraid after 1945, as perceived as going it alone. And the historical consciousness of German elites was so strong that they always tried to do something with other nations, most often with France. So this key norm of reflexive multilateralism has come under pressure. And I, as a catchword term for Germany's European policy with regard to the Schröder government, that was from 2002 to 2005, and the first Merkel government, the so-called Grand Coalition from 2005 to 2009, that Germany's European policy has become weaker, it has become leaner, and it has become meaner in the way that they really focus on their own agenda, on their own interest. Lastly, for many European partners, Germany's guarded approach to the euro crisis, especially Merkel's hesitancy to save Greece through swift credit promises, have fueled the suspicion that Germany has abandoned its European vocation, that it has been the most pro-integrationist, larger country state within Europe, and therefore has normalized or become alike with regard to France and Great Britain. I do not see it quite as dramatically. However, this episode of the euro crisis indicates a waning reflexive civility, in my view, to communicate respectfully with lesser powers and to be willing to lead through example. But it also shows an abating capacity to shape events autonomously. Now, turning to the outline, in a second step, I briefly outline the different theoretical approaches which see the sources of Germany's conduct either on the so-called systemic or subsystemic level, or the interaction between the two. Then I present the three leading hypotheses which shaped the debate on Germany's foreign policy in the 1990s. According to the first, the realist hypothesis, the sources of Germany's conduct lie in the redistribution of material power in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. And that's a very easy argument, right? Because when Germany unified, Germany got more territory. The Soviet troops withdrew from Germany back to the Soviet Union. Germany gained more citizens. 18 million East Germans joined the Federal Republic. And therefore, of course, in relative terms, Germany became more powerful, more territory, more citizens, and the Soviet Union as a potential threat towards the unified Germany withdrew. So the hypothesis is when a country becomes more powerful, it will go its own way. It will become more autonomous. It will become more unilateral. Straightforward hypothesis, what Germany would do. NATO would go out of order because Germany would simply withdraw from NATO. It would not be dependent on NATO anymore because it became more powerful. That was the realistic prognosis on German foreign policy. Second hypothesis, liberal approach, very easy to understand. The liberals are saying when the society changes and the preference of the society change, and 18 million East Germans is really a change in societal preferences. I don't want to make the joke we had in Germany when the East Germans joined West Germany, and there was a fancy talk show on what are the East Germans longing for. Stephen, you know that. And then one of the West German politicians grabbed below the table and held out a banana, right? because, of course, the East Germans had no access to fresh food, and therefore my sister, for example, has a wonderful picture of the Unification Party from November 1989. There's a public dustbin. It's covered all over like half a meter only with banana. Yeah. So what were the East Germans longing for? Bananas. Therefore, the preferences, the societal preferences. Some of you may know that Germans are, of course, world champions in banana eating. You didn't know that? No, it's true. It's true. The highest per capita banana eating country in the world. So in a way, our societal preferences didn't change that much. It just got even stronger. No, seriously, the third hypothesis, and therefore, of course, the liberal thought, with shifting societal preferences, either Germany would stick to its old course as an export champion in the world economy, or it would argue that it had to shelter the former East German industries from competition from the East and the West. Thirdly, constructivists argue that foreign policy and decision makers hold norms and values, and these norms and values really shape how they perceive material structures. What does that mean? That does mean, for example, that historical experiences, such as others try to balance Germany, that they are deeply ingrained in the historical perception of Europe within the German elites, and therefore those elites try to avoid any balancing of all other powers vis-à-vis Germany in the 1990s. In a fourth step, I evaluate these hypotheses against the background of 2 decades of policy output, as I said, 2 cases on European policy and 1 case on Bundeswehr deployment abroad. Now, and this is one of the slides I shouldn't show because it's so complex. I don't know whether you have seen this counterinsurgency PowerPoint from the Pentagon, how they envision to win the fight in Afghanistan. It's not as bad as that, but almost. Right? Let me show you what's on there. On the slide, you see you have an international level, the so-called systemic level, and this is the subsystemic level. So this is everything with what is inside Germany and that is outside Germany. There are 2 theoretical approaches, one called neorealism. They think that the relative distribution of power really determines what countries do. They do balance against other powers. Therefore, if Germany becomes more powerful, other nations will either balance against Germany or they will jump on the German bandwagon. The hypothesis here I explained to you is Germany will go its own way. Second hypothesis, neo-institutionalism. Countries look for absolute gains, and they are able to commit themselves to certain rules and procedures and institutions, and therefore they're able to cooperate and to have benefit from cooperation. Because Germany was so institutionalized after 1945, the neo-institutionalists prognosis for Germany was the Germans will just stick to their course because the benefits from being NATO member, from being EU member, are so great that they will stick to what they have. The liberals, Andrew Moravcsik, probably the most important, argue if there are shifts in societal or in individual preferences, if there are more baby boomers, that will, of course, change the foreign policy of a country. The third aspect, and that's a little bit complicated, really tries to do both, to have a systemic view on the one hand, a subsystemic view on the other hand. That's called social constructivism, and I will focus on that because I will present to you a role theoretical interpretation of Germany's foreign policy. Now, I explained that to you what social constructivism is yesterday. I try it once again. Social constructivists hold that power isn't really power because power, material power, such as a gun, has to be socially contextualized. For example, we joked about that yesterday. If I were to pull a gun right now and hold it to my head, it would make a great difference because you would think, what is this guy up to there in the front? If I was standing on a stage in a theater, no one would expect that I would kill myself, right? So the social context of where that gun is situated and whether you expect me to have a gun. I hope it's not allowed to have guns on this campus.
It's banned.
It's banned. Still,
Yep.
you know. As a German, I am concerned about that, you know. We have this bad experience with guns, right? So the social contextualization of material matter, a gun or a nuclear weapon, is the important thing. Although the United States is the most powerful actor ever in world history, Germany still considers this power not as threatening. Why? Because we regard the United States as a friendly power. I can tell you that's not the way North Koreans see the United States. They think the United States, same material power, is very threatening to the core. So material things are not just material things. You have to socially construct them to put them in context. And that's what role theory and social constructivism is about. It really divides the world into friends, rivals, and enemies. All right. This is what role theory is about. Roles appear through expectations of societies and expectations of the international society, and those two expectations through socialization and internalization lead to a certain role behavior. And the argument in short is no one expected Germany to be a military power after 1945. Nobody wanted it. We didn't want it as Germans, and others didn't want us to be great military powers. Only after 1955, when the threat of the Soviet Union was large enough, Germany was rearmed and was contained within NATO, but Germans never deployed their own forces in other countries before 1990. So there was a long tradition that Germans wouldn't go to the front and fight on foreign territory. That led to a specific role behavior. Hans Maul, who was my doctor father at the University of Trier, he said Germany and Japan, because they were the two perpetrators of the Second World War, and they were the powers socialized by the United States. Their constitutions were rewritten by the United States. They were reintegrated into the society of civilized nations after the Pacific War and the European War. These two countries hold a specific role behavior, and he called it civilian power. The civilian power relies on its big buddy, the United States, to defend it, basically, to do most of the dirty work. And the Germans and the Japanese would, of course, have a culture of reticence, Kultur der Zurückhaltung, and they would trade. There would be trading powers. So their tradition or their role would be they were willing to transfer sovereignty or autonomy to supranational organizations, more eager than other nations to do that, and they were eager to realize civilized international order. That means they were willing to forego short-term national interest for longer-term institutionalized procedures. Now, these are the three hypotheses I have pointed out. I skipped the trading power, but just read them again. There were two contending hypotheses for what the Germans would do after 1990, and there was the civilian power hypothesis. Let me then turn to the three cases, because Stephen told me to talk no more than 45 minutes. I start with the Bundeswehr and the security policy of United Germany after 1990. For Germany, the decision to establish and delegate the competence to use armed force, both domestically and externally, has been very, very complex after 1945. The point is, we had no armed force between 1949 and 1955. The mothers and fathers of the Grundgesetz really believed in a system of collective security, which means Germany needs no army because the international community will defend Germany from any threat that might be there. Not very naive, maybe somewhat naive, but the belief was if there were a German army after the Shoah, the Holocaust, and the German war over Europe, that would be life-threatening to this young democracy. Therefore, we had no army between 1949 and 1955. And it was really a domestic struggle to establish the right by the executive to build an army and to use it both externally and internally. And the struggle can be divided up in three phases. First phase is the so-called Wehrdebatte, in which the executive authority for territorial defense was established. The Notstandsdebatte, emergency debate, in the 1960s, as a result of which the use of armed force in a state of emergency was regulated, and the so-called out-of-area debate, and that's the last debate here of the 1990s, after which the authority to use force abroad was judged constitutional. And this, again, shows you we had a strong societal debate until 1994, when the Federal Constitutional Court judged for the first time, yes, it is constitutional that German forces can go abroad and use armed force there. Until then, the leading parties held the position that it was unconstitutional that German armed force would go abroad, right? So we had a humanitarian deployment without armed force. Then we had some rather unrobust peacekeeping till 1994. And then the robustness of the missions went up, right? In Afghanistan, we had special forces on the ground, 100 to 200 troops in full combat mission. So it is really a change in German conduct. This deployment pattern is often used to argue that Germany's culture of reticence, which I explained to you, is a thing of the past, and Germany uses its armed force as any other European great power. Excuse me, I shouldn't do that. I'm not convinced. No, I beg. Only you understand this joke. I have to explain it. Of course, the German foreign minister during the Iraq crisis, Joschka Fischer, had a very strong encounter with your defense minister at a very important conference, the security conference in Munich in 2003. And they were really shouting at each other. They were really angry. And at the end, for the first time, a German politician in public stood up and left the American Secretary of Defense standing there and just said, "Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, I'm not convinced." And he meant he was not convinced that it was a good idea that the United States intervened with a coalition of willing in Iraq. So he wrote a autobiography, and the title, of course, is "I'm Not Convinced." So that's the running joke for the Germans who think that Germany can say no to its biggest ally, right? I'm not convinced. So in this case, I'm not convinced that the Bundeswehr is now an armed force like any other European great power armed force. Why is that the case? I think the Bundeswehr has never been and will not be in the foreseeable future an expeditionary force. Why is that the case? The numbers and the equipment the Bundeswehr holds just do not match up with Britain and France. When you look at the deployability of our forces, it is quite low. We have a huge number of soldiers, but only 8,000 to 10,000 of them can be deployed abroad at any point in time. So the deployability is quite low. Not to speak of power projection capacities like aircraft carrier or air transport or other things. Secondly, the Bundestag, our parliament, has always set close geographical, functional, and quantitative limits on troop deployments. You may have heard that term. It's called national caveats. They are still abound in Germany's deployments. It's a nightmare for American soldiers and commanders because we have now 48 states, nations in the Afghanistan mission, and Germany holds, I don't know the correct number, but possibly 15 national caveat. That means that our soldiers can do certain things but can't do other things. For example, go out at night, out of their compound and so forth. So what happens is if the Germans have to move out, then US troops have to defend them, which makes it an awkward thing that one nation has to defend the other nation when it goes beyond the compound and stuff like that. So if it was only Germany, it wouldn't be such a problem. But if you have 48 nations, that's a big problem, because then interoperability, unity of effort, unity of command, everything that goes with it is an absolute nightmare. Yeah? The US forces have a term for that. That's war by committee, and that's the worst, right? So Germans are probably the worst of the worst when it comes to national caveats, because our Bundestag has the capacity, the competence to really limit, severely limit what the executive branch can do or not do. Thirdly, the most important constraining factor when it comes to Germany's foreign deployment is legitimacy. I just looked into 15 parliamentary debates on ISAF and OEF. These are the two mandates in Afghanistan. And the arguments used by the government are either alliance solidarity or humanitarian considerations with some anti-terrorism rhetoric spread in between. To broaden the scope of respectable reasons for the use of force is still very, 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 very difficult in Germany. Yeah? So one explanation for the resignation of our last president, Horst Köhler, was that he suggested, only vaguely, that because Germany is an export world champion, the Bundeswehr might be deployed for economic reasons abroad. And that brought a public outcry that the Bundeswehr might be sent to fight economic wars. And that was one of the reasons why our president actually resigned, because he not only misspoke, but he vaguely suggested that economics interests could drive Germany's security policy. So in a way, our discourse on what Germany can do or can't do is really still very much contained. Okay. Coming to the next slide, German deployment patterns. What you see here, we have a preference for Europe, right? That's the red line, and it goes up, obviously, 2003 here. So first indication something happened there. Two explanations. First explanation, it's the Bush hypothesis, I call it. Social constructivists think this bias towards Europe really indicates that the Germans, if they send troops abroad, do it with Europe because Europe's strategic culture is closer to Germany's culture of reticence. So not to be too robust as the United States and Afghanistan, for example. Second explanation is the realistic explanation. It's totally easy to understand why the Germans do all the stuff in the EU, because when they do stuff in the EU, the Germans are the most powerful nations. So they rule in the EU and can determine what the other Europeans are doing. So it's a realist argument why they move into the EU bias. My explanation is much easier and better than the other two, of course, is it's the role stupid, of course. Why is that the case? Well, most of the deployments here by EU forces really follow on NATO deployments, right? Especially in the Balkans. So what you see is these are a lot of police missions who follow on combat missions like KFOR or IFOR in Bosnia or in Kosovo or other places. So what you can see here, it's a division of labor. Once the NATO moves out, the EU moves in. And because the missions tend to be longer and longer, you get more and more EU missions. It has nothing to do with Germany going out of solidarity with the United States. It's just an indication that NATO fights the wars and we do the nation building afterwards. Now, in some, German deployment patterns have changed substantially over the past 2 decades, but numbers, caveats, and mandates suggest that Germans still have a long, long way to go to the front. Indeed, when you look at the voting patterns and public skepticism towards the Afghanistan operation, it is not clear at all that we will see more than 7,000 German troops currently in Afghanistan in the midterm future. You see here a growing skepticism in German parliament towards the deployment, and of course the number are still very high, 653 overall, but we're down to 400 for the deployment, as in many European nations, of course. Now turning to the EU constitutional policy. On balance, Germany certainly remained the most Europeanized member among larger states since unification. In Maastricht, where the European Union was established, Chancellor Kohl overcame concerns by our Federal Reserve Bank and leading economists when he exchanged monetary sovereignty against tangible benefits in the Eurozone. And I don't know whether all of you have seen the euro lately. No, that's just a joke. Of course, this is 50 euros. It's not broken yet, yeah. But I probably also have that's the way it goes, yeah. That's 50 euros, and we exchanged our D-mark in 2002, the German currency, for this common European currency. It looks this way, right? So Chancellor Kohl overcame the concerns by domestic actors against establishing the euro. And in Amsterdam and Nice, the German government further pushed for integration, for example, in the field of common foreign and security policy and home and justice affairs. And during the constitutionalization of the European Union, the Foreign Minister Fischer and Angela Merkel have made important contributions, both in terms of content and process to the debate. However, when we look at the content of the constitutional treaty, we are now under the so-called Lisbon Treaty. And we look at the policy process coming from the early 1990s. We see that there are quite a few German initiatives who then later show up in the treaty itself. So German fingerprints are really all over the place. The important thing here is, as I pointed out earlier, when you look very closely, this new constitutional treaty really emboldens or strengthens the member states as the master of the treaty, in contrast to strengthening the supranational organs of the community, like the European Commission and the European Court of Justice. Why is that? Before the Lisbon Treaty, it wasn't possible. There was simply no mechanism that a member state could withdraw from the treaty. It was not foreseen in the treaty. So after that, after Lisbon, a country can withdraw from the European Union. Also, there's now a charter on basic rights. There's a subsidiarity principle, and there is a clearer delimitation of EU powers than before. And all these things on the right-hand side here are really either mirror images or preferences of Germany's veto players. What do I mean by that? Through the Constitutional Court and through a change of Germany's constitution, the Bundesländer on the one hand and the Federal Constitutional Court on the other hand established a norm that only if these core norms of Germany's constitution are upheld on a European level, the European integration process could go forward. I show it to you what that means. We call this structural equivalence norms. That's the Article 23 of our Constitution, and it says, with a view to establishing a united Europe, the Federal Republic of Germany shall participate in the development of the European Union. That is committed, and now the conditions come. Only under these conditions, Germany can join European integration that goes further than before. It must be democratic. It must be social, it must be under federal principles, it must be a system of rule of law, and to the principle of subsidiarity, and that guarantees a level of protection of basic right, and now it comes, essentially comparable to that afforded by this basic law, which basically means the Germanization of the European Union, because nothing that holds up to the standard of the Federal Constitutional Court when it comes to democracy, rule of law, subsidiarity, can be written under our Constitution, which is in place now, in European treaties. And the Federal Constitutional Court judges whether the standard is there or not. And that really happens in the years after unification, that the Federal Constitutional Court grows more and more skeptical whether those conditions are met by the European Union. And because we are already well through the lecture, I show you what happened. These are all rulings by the Federal Constitutional Court. The first one, Solange I, was in 1974. The next one was in the in 1986. Maastricht was 1993, and Lisbon was in 2009. the core elements, the core standard elements by which European integration is judged become more and more, right? At the very end, here in Lisbon, there's a long, long list of standards to which the European treaties must be compatible. Otherwise, it is unconstitutional that the federal government really engages in European integration. And that's my final point, if you will, when it comes to the euro crisis and Germany's behavior, whether we can help other nations by transferring money into common funds. The Constitutional Law Court has ruled in 1993 that the euro and the European Monetary Union must not become what they call a transfer union. What is meant by that? By that is meant that German taxpayers pay for the mistakes and faults of other nations like Greece and Ireland. Therefore, the German government had to find a way to help those nations without becoming unconstitutional by establishing a transfer union. Right? That was the problem. So the Federal Constitutional Court was the crucial player who put limits on what Germany could do and could not do. And therefore, what we have seen last weekend and on the European summit level before over the euro crisis is really not only but mostly reducible to those judgments the Federal Constitutional Court established in Maastricht and Lisbon. Here you have again a quote of a German cabinet minister who says it plainly, we have to take Karlsruhe, that's the city where the Federal Constitutional Court is situated, conditions laid out in its ruling on monetary union extremely seriously. If we cannot convince the judges that the Greek rescue is a last resort reaction to safeguard the euro stability and EMU's survival, European Monetary Union, the complainants will win their case. And that would be the worst thing that could happen. Germany commits to a transfer union and then the court withdraws. Just think of what would happen at the stock markets with the whole lending procedures within the European Monetary Union. That would be really a very, very serious situation. Therefore, when you look at the position the Germans hold during the euro crisis, again, fingerprints all over the place. There is no, my argument goes, there is no constitutional court in the world that is so influential in foreign policy as the German Federal Constitutional Court. Now, in conclusion and the outlook, what are the sources of German foreign conduct and how do they relate to changes in the policy trajectory? First, the sources of Germany's conduct have changed. The public opinion has changed. The Parliament and the Federal Constitutional Court have a much greater say than 20 years ago on German foreign policy. I call this process the domestication of Germany's foreign policy conduct. But domestic changes are not only related to the politics of German foreign policy. Keep in mind that unification entailed big costs and transfers between the East and the West, between the poorer and the more prosperous regions within Germany. Secondly, yes, the policy trajectory has changed after unification, most importantly in security and European affairs, but as I have argued, these changes have been gradual rather than abrupt, and they have modified rather than revolutionized Germany's traditional institutional environment. To give you an example of that, in January 2003, the Red-Green government opposed sending German soldiers with Patriot missiles to Turkey to prevent a retaliatory assault from Iraq. Then US NATO Ambassador Burns called this a near-death experience of NATO. That was really a crucial moment in the history of the alliance. In February 2003, the Germans argued, we will not send Patriot missiles to Turkey, and the Turkish government said, well, if you don't do that, there's really nothing we can expect from you anymore, because this is really about alliance solidarity. Why did the Germans do it? Because they thought they wouldn't get the mandate in the Bundestag for it. That was the reason why. But however, NATO survived, and so did the Schröder government actually also survive, because it rightly feared that it would not have mustered the necessary votes in the Bundestag in support of the US-led decision to invade Iraq. In the end, I have shown you, or I show you the electoral map of Germany, and I think that has a lot to do with German foreign policy. We have 7 elections, state elections in Germany this year, 6 from now on. 1 very crucial in my home state, Baden-Württemberg, on March 27th. The Merkel government is under heavy public pressure with regard to the euro, because the Germans are skeptic about, as Jesse Helms once named it, putting taxpayers' money into foreign rat holes. Yeah, the Germans don't like that idea either. So they are very skeptical about giving more money to other European nations. And if those states fall, especially Baden-Württemberg, then it becomes very, 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 very difficult for the Merkel government to govern in Germany, because then the majorities in the Bundesrat and the legislative process really get stuck, and we get gridlock, what you have in the United States now. We're going to see whether you have a federal budget in the next weeks. We could get not something like that, but a serious gridlock in the German system too. So the prognosis, because the Merkel government is under such heavy pressure in 2011, you should not expect German leadership in the euro crisis this year, which is a very bad thing, right? We have this crisis in Japan. That's a big, big, very serious thing. But of course, the euro crisis is not over yet. And if the biggest economy in Europe is not in the shape, and able to act swiftly in the crisis, that's a bad thing too. And therefore, the outlook is not perfect to end on this theme. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks a lot. We have 2 brief responses from colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm going to ask Sabine von Dierke, who comes from the great city of Stuttgart in Baden-Württemberg, to give the first response. Sabine is my colleague in the German department over at the University of Pittsburgh. And she's, a wonderful expert on multiculturalism in Germany. She's written a book called All Power to the Imagination about the emergence of the movement that led to the Greens. So I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your kind introduction. Thank you also for this interesting talk. And as Stephen already said, I'm coming here from outfield, from left field maybe. I'm not a political scientist. And so I'm not even trying to rebuttal here the talk, which I found in large parts very, very persuasive. But there are a couple of things which you also promised in the beginning of a more conceptual nature, which I would like you to maybe come back to. First of all, when you introduced the talk, you spoke about that normalization is not a good analytic tool for describing German foreign policy. I totally agree. It muddles the waters, it doesn't clear them. However, you have not really told us that, well, why it's not a good term. Because in some ways, couldn't we also argue, isn't it a perfectly normal trajectory, what you described with great detail and persuasion, if you look at German foreign policy from two perspectives, namely a very historical one, which you have done in parts, and secondly, let me rehash here the old Clinton slogan, it's the economy. Because think about it, what happened to Germany? Very, very cleverly, they refused to rebuild their armed forces. They did not waste their Marshall money on the armed forces like Britain did and France. So in some ways, it was smart because it allowed them to capitalize on the money they got, which other countries in Europe also got after 45, but it also required them, in parts because of the Shoah, the Holocaust, I totally agree with the moral impact, but in parts it was also a very savvy economic strategy. At the same time, as we just have heard in this wonderful talk, the founding fathers, and this was news to me, and I'm very grateful that you pointed that out to me with your talk. The founding fathers and few mothers who drafted the Constitution, whether they were the fingerprints of the US or not, had obviously constructed the basic law in such a manner that Germany, that's my argument, was able to hide very cleverly behind West Germany, behind a lot of the Constitutional Court or the basic law, not to get involved in dumping more money or more bodies in the just quoted rat holes as we, the Americans, do all the time. So in some ways I would say maybe that is really the normal trajectory of West Germany and then unified Germany, to deal and wheel behind the scenes, invoking the Constitution and the constitutional state to great effect, to get actually their economic solutions, because some have argued, particularly if you look at the Irish crisis, which unfolded after the Greece debacle, that basically Germany dictated, pointing to the Constitution, hooray to the constitutional state, we can't do it, but basically dictated the conditions, and worse conditions than the IMF, for Greece and Ireland. So in some way, you could argue both ways. It's normalization, or the normal thing for Germany was to hide behind it and build up their economy and be still in better shape than we are. So that's the one thing. The other thing which I'm always a little bit concerned about is the notion or the concept of leadership. Yeah? Because it seems to imply, and I sense that at the very end here too, when we warned us, don't expect strong leadership from Germany. And I'm not making here a moral argument, and you again very persuasively actually showed the problems domestically for Germany at this moment. But why are we so hung up in international politics about leadership? What is so preferred in leadership? If you think about this what did you call it, reflexive multilateral approach, doesn't it get us much further? Haven't we gotten ourselves into enough wars already? Can we solve international crises with unilateral approaches? No. We Americans should know better. Yeah? So in many ways, I would say, hopefully this kind of approach Germany has in some ways modeled with still very strong national interests, yeah? But with behind the scenes. should perhaps become more the normal approach than trying to solve things in a way which is destructive. So if you could a little bit elaborate also on why are we still so infused by the idea of leadership after we have seen that leadership leads us often in the wrong direction and our tax money, whether it's the Germans or the Americans, down the proverbial rat holes. I have somewhat more, but we have no time, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, and now another political science perspective. Patrick Altdorfer, also from the University of Pittsburgh, who teaches courses at the University of Pittsburgh on comparative politics, world politics, German government and politics, American foreign policy, and even politics through film.
Well, it's been a while since I've done world politics, so if Sabina's comments came from center field, mine are maybe coming from the shortstop, because it's been a while. Constructivism is not the area that I've worked in, but I also found your talk very persuasive and very interesting, and I found myself agreeing as I was reading the paper, agreeing with a lot of your conclusions. Because I wasn't as familiar with the constructivist approach, and I haven't done a lot of reading on that since I wrote my dissertation before that approach really came about. I found interesting that it reminded me of some of the more multi-level analytical approaches to understanding foreign policy that I've studied in the American context, where we looked at things, we looked at the international system level, the realist and liberal approach, but also came down to the decision-making levels of analysis, the societal factors. I don't know if you could go back to that slide that you had put up, slide number 5, I believe it was. One of the questions that I had is in the paper and then looking through the slides, you mentioned that public opinion plays a role, that German foreign policy has been domesticized and that public opinion is one of the major impetuses there. But one thing that I thought was missing in the talk, maybe because of the format of the length of the talk, and you go into more detail, and certainly I think in your book probably. Where does public opinion fit here? I assume it fits in this box. That would be something that I think would be worth exploring, particularly if you look at, and I looked at some of the recent public opinion surveys in Germany, there's overwhelming opposition on security matters. That's what I'm mostly interested in, to Bundeswehr involvement in deployment in Afghanistan. I mean, we're talking about opposition to German opposition to the Afghan intervention in the 70–80% range. It's actually really quite stunning. By contrast, we've also got large majorities against the Afghanistan conflict in the United States now as well, but more in the 40, 50, 60% range. That's where we have been. So I think I would like to hear more from you about that. Where does the public opinion, what role does that play? I think you do an excellent job in explaining these other domestic factors, particularly the Constitutional Court, Federal Constitutional Court, and its veto power. Coming back to one theoretical aspect here, and again, this is the civilian power concept is new to me, and I understand that Hans Mao developed that, and you also work on that. One of the questions I had, you sort of answered at the beginning when you discussed this, but I wanted to be sure that I am clear on this. Are there other countries besides Germany and Japan that can be considered civilian powers, or are they the only two cases? If they are the only two cases, then let me just play devil's advocate. What's the point of the concept? Okay, I like the concept though, by the way. But are there others that could be considered that? Mao has just written in a book that has just come out that the European Union might be considered a civilian power. So is this, are there nation states or other state actors that can be considered civilian power? Might other international organizations be considered civilian powers? And then finally, the third question I guess I had was, on your last slide, you ended with the prognosis that was very pessimistic. Do not expect strong German leadership in 2011. Is this your prediction only for the Euro crisis, or do you see, does that carry over into, say, intervention in Libya, for instance? This is the NATO has been discussing this today, and the Arab League has passed a resolution on Saturday asking the West to intervene with a no-fly zone. NATO is taking this up. Britain and France have already argued in favor of a no-fly zone. Germany, Chancellor Merkel has been somewhat circumspect about that, and the U.S. has also been fairly cautious and non-committal on it. So, if you could address those points as well, I would enjoy hearing it.
Our time is relatively limited, and so what I'd like to do is for you to hold that thought and the response. And I'd like to pick up maybe about 5 or 6 questions or comments from the audience, just kind of collect them. And then finally, we do need to be out of here at 6, unfortunately. And so then you can kind of respond to all of that at once. So maybe about 5 or 6 comments from the audience.
I have one.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting that you talk about the various theories of IR. My students just had an exam on realism, liberalism, and constructivism today, so I'm going to demand that someone say something who's in my class. I'm looking at some of you. But one thing I did want to say is that I found really fascinating. You mentioned that the German federal court, constitutional court, and you said kind of deeper involvement in foreign policy than any kind of domestic court in the world. I hadn't ever thought about it in those terms, but if that in fact is the case, I think it's probably a model that we're going to see in some ways in other countries. I like the way that the speaker mentioned, a way to hide from having involvement in some of the various parts of the world that are taking place. Because I'm really interested in knowing more about the structure of that court, because I can't think of anything equivalent really in the U.S. or the countries that I really know very well. So I found that to be a really fascinating point. But I now want to look at some of my students who just got tested on these big theories that you're talking about today to see if they can say something.
Don't be shy. Come on, let's ask some questions. Yeah.
Actually, if you don't mind, I have 2 questions for you, sir. The first one was just a clarification question for me. You kept throwing around the term veto players. And I wasn't sure personally whether you meant that this was some sort of court in Germany that corresponds to the European Union, or if it's something in German politics itself that I have no concept of. But if you wouldn't mind clarifying that for me, I would greatly appreciate that. And in terms of the different theories, early in the talk you outlined 3 different scenarios that you defined as hypotheses about how Germany would react under different theories and what have you. And I don't know if it's because the talk got rushed or because time is stopping us from having the full time here, but I was curious out of those 3 scenarios between realism, liberal theory, and constructivism theory, what you believe most aptly applies to the Germany we're going to see in the next 5 years. You talked a lot about the role-playing policy actor theory, but out of those 3 schools of thought, what do you believe is most practical for the United States in terms of our dealings with Germany in the near future?
Because Germans, after 1945 at least, became law-abiding citizens, right, and civilized citizens, the institutional setup, what we call Republican liberalism under Moravcsik terms, really drives a lot of German foreign policy. Yeah, when it comes to societal influence, that is often brought through the party system or through the judicial system into into the foreign policy process. And I think it is crucial to see, although we have 70% at this time about Afghanistan. Let me show you the numbers. We have 70% against the Afghanistan deployment. You have pretty high rates in the parliament, so there's a big spread, if you will, between the public and their representatives. And the point is that foreign policy doesn't become really an issue in elections. So the political system can really buffer the public discontent with the administration's policy at this point in time. It hasn't spilled over. And my argument would be, because I'm pro-Afghanistan deployment, I think we must stay there. Yeah? Of course we do. They have done a pretty bad deal in selling that policy, right? Just only one point, because Afghanistan is really crucial. When you look at and we talked about that yesterday in that radio interview as well, Afghanistan, the society never ever really had a chance. When you look at the troop to citizens ratio, Afghanistan is the most underdeployed crisis we ever had in the last 20 years, because US forces count that you need 20 troops per 1,000 inhabitants in order to do a good peacekeeping job. We had 0.5 soldiers on the ground for 1,000 inhabitants in Afghanistan. The quota in the Balkans was 13 to 20 or 21 to 20. Yeah? I know it's really controversial, but Afghans are not as dear to us as Europeans are, right? So if we want to really solve this problem, we should get more boots on the ground so this country really has a chance. And of course, Germany has a stake in that. Just the last one, veto player, just Google George Sebelius. That's the one who coined Sebelius. Yeah. He coined that term. Basically, these are people who can't say no in the political process. I almost got them, Stephen. There were just two missing.
Yep.
Stephen's about to be a veto player.
Yeah.
I promised that I would get people out by 6 o'clock. So from our very young 100-year-old university, this is our tartan plan, by the way. We have a little present for you.
Oh.
To your very old university, the oldest one in Germany. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.